All right, let's go global today.
Sounds fun.
We're diving deep into the world of governments.
Yeah.
You know how the executive and legislative and judicial branches?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to look at how those function in 6 different countries. Pretty different countries, actually.
Okay.
China, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, Russia, and the United Kingdom.
Wow. That's quite a range.
It is quite a range.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, definitely a challenge. So let's get started with China, a country where, the Communist Party, the CCP,
Yeah.
and the government, they're really kind of intertwined.
Yeah, they have this, it's often called a dual rule system.
Right.
But, the truth is the CCP, they're really the ones holding the power.
Right.
They set the agenda, they control who gets which important job, they even influence, how the laws are interpreted.
So it's not just about, who's officially in charge.
No.
It's about where the power really lies.
Right.
So how does that actually work? How does that power play out?
Well, take internet censorship, for example. The CCP has a huge amount of control over what people in China can see online.
Right.
And this isn't just them passing laws.
Right.
It's about how their influence is everywhere in society.
So even though they have a president and a premier, it's really the CCP's Politburo and that standing committee, that's like the small group at the top, that are making the decisions.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Think of it this way. The Politburo, they set the big direction, and the government, they just put those policies into action.
Okay.
And at the very top of all of this is the General Secretary of the CCP.
Right.
And that same person is also the president.
So that's Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
So he's got double the power there.
Yeah, he's powerful.
What about the National People's Congress?
Mm-hmm.
So their legislature, right?
Right.
Do they ever push back against what the CCP wants to do?
There have been a few times, yeah.
Okay.
Back in 1999, they weren't happy about a new tax on fuel. But most of the time, they pretty much just approve whatever the CCP wants.
Right. It's not a system where you see a lot of debate
No, not
or
much.
people disagreeing openly.
Right.
Okay. And then there's the judiciary. So that's the court system.
Mm.
Does that operate independently in China, or is that also under the CCP's control?
Well, they have been trying to modernize their civil courts
Wow.
and, to make it more attractive for foreign businesses.
Right.
But it's not really independent.
Okay.
And the criminal justice system, that's even worse.
Okay.
People don't have basic rights.
Right.
And they don't get a fair trial.
So it sounds like control is the priority there, not individual liberties.
That's one way to put it.
All right, let's move on to Iran now, where religion is a big part of the government.
Yes.
They have a supreme leader,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
How did that fit into everything else?
So the supreme leader, he's appointed for life.
Wow.
And he has the final say on pretty much everything.
Really?
It's interesting because it's a mix of, religious rule and elections. He's in charge of the military, judiciary, the media,
Right.
and he even chooses important people in other parts of the government.
Wow.
So he really shapes the whole political scene.
So even though they have a president that people vote for,
Mm-hmm.
the supreme leader is still above him.
Right. That's a good observation.
That raises some questions about how power is balanced.
For sure.
And it's not just the supreme leader, right? There's also the Guardian Council.
Yeah.
Tell me about them.
So that's a group of 12 Islamic jurists.
Okay.
And they basically decide who can even run for office.
Okay.
And they make sure all the laws follow Islamic principles.
Wow.
They can even say no to the results of an election.
So even if the people vote for someone,
Yeah,
the Guardian Council can just say, we don't want that person.
that's right.
That's a lot of power.
It is.
What happens if, the elected parliament and the Guardian Council disagree?
Well, in those cases, they have the Expediency Council. That's like an advisory group to the supreme leader.
Right, yeah.
And they try to settle the dispute.
Yeah.
And they can even overrule the parliament if they have to.
So the supreme leader really does have a lot of control.
Yeah, he does.
But their constitution, it does give some power to the models, right? Their parliament.
Yes, they can pass laws,
Okay.
but those laws still have to be approved by the Guardian Council.
Right.
So it's a system where religion often has more weight than what the people vote for.
Okay, so I'm seeing a pattern here. These systems, they might look democratic,
Yeah.
but how they actually work is quite different.
Yeah, appearances can be deceiving.
Let's move on to Mexico.
Okay.
Now they have a presidential system, which sounds more familiar,
It does.
but I'm guessing it's not that simple.
You're right, it's not that straightforward.
Okay.
Mexico is in a kind of transition period, you could say.
Right.
They're moving away from being dominated by one party.
Which party was that?
That was the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI. And they're trying to create a system with more checks and balances.
So they're trying to limit how much power the president has.
Yeah, exactly.
But how powerful is the Mexican president right now?
They still have a lot of power, to be honest.
Okay.
They choose the cabinet, they can veto laws that the legislature passes,
Right.
and they can even issue these things called decrees that basically act like laws.
Wow.
That's something they kept from the PRI's time,
Okay.
when the president had almost all the power.
So decrees that are like laws.
Yeah.
That's a lot of power for one person.
It is a lot.
Doesn't Mexico have a Congress?
Oh, yes, they do.
Okay.
It's called the Congress of the Union,
Okay.
and it's bicameral, meaning it has two chambers,
Okay.
the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate.
Right. So two parts to their Congress.
Yeah, and they're starting to become more assertive.
Okay. So they're pushing back a bit more.
Yeah, especially because now you often have divided government.
What does that mean?
That means that different parties control the presidency and the Congress,
Oh, interesting.
so there's more opposition.
So when they're from different parties, you see more pushback
Exactly.
on those presidential decrees.
Yeah.
That's interesting. What about their judicial system?
Uh-huh.
Can the courts in Mexico, like, challenge the president or the legislature?
They do have judicial review.
Okay.
That means they can say no to laws that go against the Constitution.
Okay.
So that's a really important part of their system of checks and balances.
Right. It's that idea of keeping everyone in check.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing there are still challenges.
Oh, yeah.
What are some of those?
Well, corruption is a big problem.
Okay.
Especially at the local levels.
Right.
And that weakens the judiciary.
It makes it hard for them to be effective.
Exactly.
So it seems like they have potential,
Yeah,
but they still need to strengthen the rule of law.
that's right.
Okay. Let's go to Nigeria now.
Okay.
Another country with a presidential system.
Yeah,
But I know they've had their own issues, right?
they have.
A young democracy. They've struggled with corruption, military coups in the past.
That's all true.
So how are they doing with balancing power between the different branches?
It's something they're still working on, like Mexico.
Okay.
They're trying to figure out how to give the legislature and the judiciary more power to keep an eye on the president.
Right.
Now, the president in Nigeria, they're elected directly,
Okay.
and they can only serve 2 terms.
Right. So there are some limits.
Yes, but they still have quite a bit of influence.
Okay. Why is that?
Well, it's partly because of the patronage system that's tied to their oil money.
What does that mean? What's a patronage system?
It basically means that the president can use the wealth from oil
Right. Yeah.
to make alliances and reward people who support him,
Oh, I see.
which makes it harder for the legislature or the judiciary to hold him accountable.
It's like he's using the oil money to strengthen his own position.
Yeah, it can be seen that way.
Wow. So in Nigeria's case, having all that oil wealth might actually be a problem for their democracy.
It's a double-edged sword, for sure.
What about their legislature?
Mm-hmm.
Have they been able to use their power effectively?
Oh, there's a great example of this.
Okay, tell me.
The legislature, which is called the National Assembly,
Right.
they actually managed to stop a former president from getting a 3rd term.
Wow. So they can stand up to the president
Yeah.
when they need to.
They have the power to impeach the president,
Hmm.
override his vetoes,
Okay.
and generally hold the executive branch accountable.
That's a good sign.
It is.
What about the judiciary in Nigeria? Are they truly independent?
Well, the Supreme Court, they do have judicial review powers.
Okay.
But like in Mexico, they're still facing challenges.
What kind of challenges?
Corruption is a big one.
Right.
And the fact that they had military rule in the past
Okay.
makes it harder for them to be truly independent.
So it seems like creating a strong, independent judiciary.
Yeah.
That's a common problem for new democracies.
It is a tough one.
Okay, 2 more countries left.
Sounds good.
Let's talk about Russia. They have a semi-presidential system.
Right.
How's that different from the presidential systems we've talked about?
In Russia, the president has way more power than in a typical presidential system.
Okay.
Like, they choose the prime minister,
Mm-hmm.
but that prime minister often ends up being more like a manager
Okay.
than a real political rival.
So it's almost like a president with a really strong vice president,
Kind of, yeah.
but the president is still definitely in charge.
Oh, absolutely.
What about the legislature in Russia? Do they have any real power in this system?
So their legislature is called the Federal Assembly,
Okay.
and it's bicameral. So they have a Duma, which is like the lower house,
Mm.
and then a Federation Council. That's the upper house.
Okay. So a 2-part system like in Mexico,
Right.
but I'm guessing it doesn't work quite the same way?
No, not really.
Yeah.
You see, there's this party called United Russia,
Okay.
which is Putin's party.
Right.
And they're so dominant that it's hard for the legislature to really challenge the president.
So it's kind of like a one-party system, even though they have multiple parties.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
And what about their courts?
Mm-hmm.
Do they have any power to keep the president or the legislature in check?
Technically, they do have judicial review,
Okay.
but in reality, they're not very independent.
So they can't really challenge the president.
No, not really.
What happens instead?
Well, the courts are often used to target people who disagree with the government.
Really?
Yeah, and to silence any opposition.
Wow. So the judiciary is really used to protect those in power.
It often seems that way.
Okay. Last stop on our tour.
Right.
The United Kingdom. Because
Okay.
now they have a parliamentary system, right?
Yes.
It's very different from all these presidential and semi-presidential systems we've been talking about.
It is, yeah.
How so?
In a parliamentary system, the executive and legislative branches are more closely connected.
Okay.
So the prime minister, they're chosen from the party that has the majority in the House of Commons.
Which is their legislature.
Right, their elected parliament.
Okay, so the prime minister comes from the most powerful party in the parliament.
Exactly.
And because they don't have divided government,
Mm-hmm.
the prime minister ends up having a lot of power.
Yeah, they really do.
So the prime minister is kind of like the captain
Yeah.
steering the government
Right.
with the support of their party in parliament.
Exactly.
But what about the monarch?
Yes.
Doesn't the UK have a king?
They do. King Charles.
Right.
He's the head of state.
But I'm guessing he doesn't actually run the government?
No, his role is mostly ceremonial.
Okay.
The real power lies with the prime minister and the cabinet.
So he's more like a symbol
Yeah,
of tradition and national identity,
right.
but the prime minister is the one making the decisions.
Exactly.
Okay, now tell me about their bicameral legislature.
Mm-hmm.
We know they have the House of Commons, which is the elected part.
Right.
What about the other chamber?
The other chamber is the House of Lords. They can look at bills passed by the House of Commons.
Okay.
They can make changes.
Right.
They can even delay things.
Right.
But in the end, they don't have as much power as the House of Commons.
So the House of Commons is really where the action is.
Yeah, that's the heart of it.
What about their judiciary?
Mm-hmm.
Can they keep the prime minister and the government in check?
They can, yeah.
Okay.
The UK Supreme Court, which was created in 2009,
Okay, relatively recent then.
Yeah.
Right.
they have a really important job.
What do?
They make sure that the government respects people's rights.
Okay, so they're like guardians of the Constitution.
You could say that.
Can they, like, overturn laws passed by Parliament?
That's where it gets interesting.
Right.
Unlike in the U.S.,
Right.
the UK Supreme Court, they can't just invalidate a law passed by Parliament.
Oh,
So they can hold the government accountable,
right.
but they can't overrule what the legislature decides.
That's a really important difference.
It is.
It shows that even within these categories, like parliamentary system,
Mm-hmm.
there can be big differences in how power is shared.
Exactly.
You really have to look deeper than just the label
Absolutely.
to understand how a government really works.
You got it.
Wow. So many different ways to run a country.
Right. It's amazing.
You've got systems based on party control, like we saw in China.
Hmm.
Religion is a big factor in Iran.
Yeah.
Strong presidents, like in Mexico and Nigeria.
And then you have the parliamentary system in the UK, which is a whole different approach.
It really shows how countries value different things.
Absolutely.
So we've seen how the executive, legislative, and judicial branches work in these 6 countries.
Right.
But let's talk about what that actually means for people.
Yeah, how does it affect their daily lives?
Right, because a government structure has a huge impact on people's freedoms,
Absolutely.
their access to justice, even their economic opportunity.
Something like that, yeah.
So, for example, in China, where the CCP controls so much, people can't just say whatever they want
Right.
or protest against the government.
That's a big contrast to the UK, where you have a lot more freedom of speech.
And in Iran, even though they have elections,
Mhm.
the Guardian Council, they really limit who can even run for office.
Exactly.
So the voters don't have a lot of real choices.
It's very different from Mexico, where they're trying to make elections more competitive.
Right, they're trying to move away from that one-party dominance.
Yeah.
And the fact that their legislature and judiciary are becoming more independent,
Mm-hmm.
that suggests they're moving in the right direction.
It does, yeah.
They're building those checks and balances that are so important for democracy.
Right. Those checks help make sure no one branch gets too much power.
But in places like Nigeria and Russia,
Yeah.
where corruption is a problem,
And where the courts aren't truly independent.
right, it's a different story there.
It is.
I imagine it must be so frustrating for people in those countries
Oh, definitely.
when they feel like the system is rigged against them.
When you can't trust the institutions,
Yeah,
it's hard to feel like you have any power.
especially if you try to challenge powerful people.
Or powerful institutions.
Yeah.
Exactly. And when corruption gets really bad,
Mhm.
it undermines everything.
People lose faith in the government,
Right.
and it creates an environment where only the wealthy and connected can succeed,
It becomes a game that's impossible to win.
unless you're already part of the elite.
Exactly.
So it's not just about what's written in the Constitution.
No.
It's about whether those rules are actually followed.
And whether they're serving the people they're supposed to serve.
Right. It's about whether the government is truly accountable to its citizens.
Exactly.
And that brings up an important point for all of us.
What's that?
We need to pay attention to these differences in government structures
Yeah.
and understand what they mean for people living in those countries.
Because what happens in one country, it can affect the whole world.
Right. Think about China's growing power,
Yeah.
economically, militarily.
That's directly connected to their political system.
Right. The CCP's control allows them to make decisions quickly,
And to plan for the long term.
and that gives them an advantage on the global stage.
For sure.
And then you have Iran with their theocratic regime.
Yeah.
That affects regional stability in a different way.
Right. There's support for certain groups
Mhm.
and their nuclear program
Those create tension with their neighbors
and with the international community.
and Russia, where Putin has consolidated so much power.
Yeah.
And then there's the conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Those raise serious concerns about authoritarianism.
And about the decline of democracy.
It shows that a country's internal politics
Yeah.
can have a huge impact on the rest of the world.
They can, definitely.
So it's clear that a country's government, it's not just their own business.
That a global issue.
It affects all of us.
Right.
But what can we actually do about it?
That's a tough question.
Can we really influence how other countries are governed?
It's complicated, but I think we can start by staying informed, engaging in dialogue, and supporting organizations that promote democracy and human rights.
So raising awareness, educating ourselves, and supporting those who are working for positive change.
Yeah, it's a long-term effort.
But it's worth it.
It is.
And we can also learn from other countries,
Right.
both their successes and their failures.
By studying different systems,
Yeah.
we can get a better sense of what works and what doesn't.
It's like having a global laboratory for studying government.
I like that analogy.
We can all learn from each other
Share our knowledge and experiences.
and work together to find solutions.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture. Now let's dive a little deeper into some of the specific challenges these countries are facing
Sounds good.
and how their government structures either help or hinder them in addressing those challenges.
Okay, where should we start?
Let's start with China.
Okay.
One of their biggest challenges seems to be balancing their economic growth.
Which has been incredible.
Yeah, it's been amazing.
But it's come at a cost.
Right. They've lifted millions out of poverty.
But they haven't done much for political reform.
Can they keep that tight control on power
Mm-hmm.
and also address the growing demand for more freedom and accountability?
Especially from the middle class, which is getting bigger all the time.
It seems like a difficult balance to strike.
It is, for sure.
What about Iran?
Yeah.
Their challenge seems to be reconciling their religious rule,
The aspirations of a young population.
a population that's increasingly connected to the outside world.
Exactly. It's a clash between tradition and modernity.
Right, you have young people wanting more freedom,
But the regime wants to stay in control.
which creates a lot of tension.
And potential instability, yeah.
Can the regime adapt and reform,
That's the big question.
or will they just crack down even harder?
And risk a backlash from their own people.
Okay, let's move on to Mexico. They're facing a different set of challenges, right?
They are.
Corruption and the rule of law seem to be their biggest hurdles.
Yeah, those are big ones.
They've made some progress, though.
They have, especially with the judiciary becoming more independent.
But corruption is so deeply rooted,
It's a tough problem to solve.
it undermines trust in the government,
Yeah.
discourages investment.
And it fuels violence and instability.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is.
What about Nigeria?
Okay.
They've dealt with military coups, widespread corruption.
Yeah.
How are they doing with building a stable democracy?
They need to strengthen their institutions.
Okay.
Make them more accountable to the people.
So it's about making sure the government actually serves its citizens.
Exactly.
They have a lot of potential, though.
They do, yeah.
A vibrant civil society,
Yeah.
a growing economy.
But they need to invest in education, healthcare, job creation.
Right, and they need to address those ethnic tensions.
Yeah, that's been a source of conflict for a long time.
Building a sense of national unity.
That's crucial for them.
Okay. 2 more to go.
Sounds good.
What about Russia?
Ah, Russia.
They seem to be going in a very different direction
You do, yeah?
than a lot of other countries.
Their biggest challenge is moving away from personalized rule.
Okay, so away from Putin, basically.
Yeah, he's been in power for so long.
And there's no clear plan for what happens after he's gone.
Right. They need to create a system that doesn't rely on just one person.
Because when all the power is in one person's hands,
Yeah.
it's a recipe for corruption.
Cronyism, suppression of dissent.
It's not sustainable in the long run.
It's not, no.
Okay, last one, the UK.
Okay.
Their challenge seems to be figuring out life after Brexit.
And dealing with the divisions in their society.
Right. Those divisions seem to have gotten worse since Brexit.
Yeah, it's exacerbated a lot of the existing inequalities.
And then there's the question of Scottish independence.
Another layer of complexity.
So they've got a lot on their plate.
They do.
It's a time of big changes for them
It is.
and a lot of uncertainty.
Absolutely.
So each of these countries
Mm.
faces its own unique set of challenges.
Right.
And their government structure plays a big role.
In how they respond to those challenges.
But it's interesting.
What is it?
Even within the same type of government,
Yeah.
like a presidential system,
Uh-huh.
you see such different outcomes.
Right.
Just compare Mexico and Nigeria.
Okay.
They both have presidential systems,
But
but Mexico is moving toward a more solid democracy.
while Nigeria is still struggling with corruption.
And weak institutions,
Yeah.
it shows that the structure of the government,
Mm-hmm.
it's only part of the story.
Right. You also have to consider the political culture,
Okay.
the strength of civil society,
Hmm.
and the role of the media.
In holding the government accountable.
It's like having two houses with the same blueprint,
Okay.
but built on different foundations.
I like that.
One house might be strong and sturdy.
Well, the other one falls apart.
Exactly.
We've really covered a lot of ground here.
We have from China to the UK.
So many different systems, each with their own pros and cons.
It's been quite a journey.
What are some of the big takeaways you hope our listeners will remember from this deep dive?
I think the most important thing to remember is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution for good government.
Right. What works in one place might not work somewhere else.
Exactly. It's about finding a system that strikes the right balance
Okay.
between strong leadership and accountability.
Right. You need both.
You need to protect individual rights.
And promote the well-being of all citizens.
That's the goal.
And we've also seen that context is everything.
Yeah,
You can't judge a system just by its name.
right.
You have to look at the history, the
Yeah.
culture, the social factors that shaped how it developed.
It's like trying to understand a person. You
Yeah.
can't just look at their job title,
You have to know their background.
their experiences, their values.
And we also have to be aware of our own biases.
That's a good point.
We tend to view other countries through our own lens.
Right, based on our own experiences and values.
But to really understand these systems,
You have to try to see things from their perspective.
it's like watching a movie in a foreign language.
Yeah,
You might not understand all the words
but you can still appreciate the story.
and the cultural context.
Exactly,
This deep dive has also highlighted the importance of critical thinking.
for sure.
We've had to sift through a lot of information, evaluate the evidence, draw our own conclusions.
It's like solving a puzzle,
Yeah.
putting all the pieces together.
But even with all this knowledge,
There's always more to learn.
right, it's an ongoing process.
It's like opening a door to a huge library.
And there are countless books to read.
Exactly.
So before we wrap up,
Okay,
let's leave our listeners with a final,
something to think about.
something that builds on what we've discussed.
How about this?
Okay.
If you could design your own ideal system of government,
Okay.
what would it look like?
What would you borrow from the systems we've talked about?
What would you do differently?
That's a great question.
It's like a challenge
To our listeners,
to be political architects.
designing a better world.
Because the search for good governance,
It never really ends.
it's an ongoing experiment.
We have to keep reflecting, keep adapting, and keep learning from each other.
Well said.
So until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep working to make the world a better place.
I like that.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.
It's been a pleasure.